Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Eve History. I am, of course, Taladar, and I am alone this week. We don't have a guest on this episode of the Eve History Show. But before we get started, and I'll explain why we don't have a guest this week and what our topic this week is, but before we get started, a bit of housekeeping news. So last week's show, which featured Tyrex Thork, who talked of the Guiding Hand Social Club exploits and stuff like that was unfortunately plagued with a little bit of audio issues at the start, so the VOD for that will be going up tomorrow, and on the June 16th or 17th show, whatever show it is next week, there won't be a live stream, unfortunately, because I will be out of town, so we will be putting this VOD up on next week's schedule, time to put VODs, so that will be it. And today's show actually will lead into potentially what future shows will be about. And that will be talking about the Fountain War. Now, the Fountain War is a bit of a contentious thing more recently because of a Kickstarter, because of the Mittani media, and because of some of the things that helped lead to this more recent war that we saw in EVE Online called World War B. The Fountain War was also a fairly notable war because it saw coalitions become more of a prominent thing in the more modern EVE history. It saw coalitions choosing sides. It saw one side versus the other on pretty much every aspect of how EVE's map worked at the time, with the exception of the drone regions, which to a degree is true and to a degree isn't. The one thing also about Fountain War is it was also my first war in EVE, so that's why I want to do this solo. I want to talk about what got this war to be what it is before we actually get into the war discussion itself, when we bring in other people like some of the FCs and campaign commanders from their respective alliances and coalitions, you know, fighting on either the CFC side or on the Honey Badger / N3 coalition side. Those are things we're going to talk about in future episodes, and you know, it's coming down the line, and I keep saying we're trying to do this, we're trying to do that. Trust me, we're going to be getting to the more nitty-gritty wars. We'll talk about Fountain War, we'll talk about the Halloween War, we'll try to talk about the Great Wars, because the Great Wars are so important to EVE's history. But Fountain War and the way it started is very, very much what EVE is. It's the very definition of how EVE works. EVE is not just a game where you have these, you know, mastermind conniving things where A leads to B all the time. It's always a shifting of the sands, if you will. It's a way for people to understand how EVE Wars works. The best analogy is that it's a continuous rolling of the tide. It never stops. One war will always lead into the next war. We've seen this more recently with the World War B, where arguably you could say that the events of the Halloween War back in 2014 led into the events that caused the casus belli of World War B. And a lot of the time, and very much with this case with Fountain War is why I chose this to talk about it, and we'll talk about this in other wars, but a lot of the time, EVE isn't just a war. EVE wars are not just about the politics of the players involved. It's not just disagreements that people have. It usually, and especially in the case of Fountain War, and you'll find out more about it in a few minutes, a lot of the times EVE wars, much like real wars, are caused by financial incentives, by financial stability, by financial desires, of one side or the other. You'll see this in real life. You know, the Crusades wasn't just a war about religion. It was a war about finance and commerce. It was controlling the rights, the entrances to the Middle East, and that led to Asia. That was a war all about that. People who go to North America during the earliest eras, and you know, the fighting between the British and the French, the British and the Spanish, those weren't wars about ideologies or politics. Those were wars over commerce. The Civil War in North America, or the United States, that wasn't a war about ideologies, although you could say it was. It was also predominantly a war about finance and commerce and economy. And Fountain War is no different. Fountain War is the prototypical war that you see throughout human history. It's a war between two sides over financial stability for one or the other. There was politics involved, there was ideology involved, but you still have commerce and economics playing a major role into it. So to understand the landscape that we're in right now, to understand what caused the Fountain War to be the way it is, we have to go back a little bit before the Fountain War. Now, the map we have right here isn't exactly the best map, and it isn't the map that was before Fountain War, but it was a good map to use. So we're going to switch over to a map from 2013 on April 10th. This is the map as of April 10th, 2013. Now, as you see at first glance of this map, you kind of see these large blobs of alliances. Now, at the time, you have groups that you may have heard of more recently. You have, in this era, or this area, you have the CFC. Now, the CFC eventually became the Imperium more recently, but they're always known as the CFC, and that's why we call them the CFC. They're one of the longest running coalitions, with the exception of Providence Bloc. But even then, CFC is still one of the biggest coalitions the game has ever seen. The Clusterfuck Coalition, for lack of a better term, was a coalition made out of a clusterfuck. It was created because they realized that they needed to band together and hold the North. And they held the North for 6 years. And this was 3 years ago that they were still holding on to it. This was the middle of the CFC's life. Because today you could argue that the Imperium replaced the CFC and the CFC is no longer a thing, but regardless, the CFC is a huge deal, and you have these things that are causing these coalitions to form. So the CFC lived in the North. They were still the dominant force in the game even back then. Now, granted, they weren't a super capital and Titan dominant force, but they were still very much a strong power block within EVE's nullsec. And you have another group down here just to the south of them. Test Alliance, Raiden, Tribal Band, and a few others. And they created what was called the HBC, which stood for the Honey Badger Coalition, named after a very jovial and funny Honey Badger ain't give no shit or don't give no shit video that was on YouTube that came out around not too long before this. Now, the Honey Badger Coalition didn't just include Test Alliance, please ignore. Test Alliance was arguably the largest alliance and most important alliance in the HBC, but it wasn't just them. It was them, it was Pandemic Legion, it was Northern Coalition, it was a few other alliances of smaller stature, but still of grave importance. And the HBC wasn't just ran by Test Alliance. Eventually, it fell into the hands of other people, which caused issues along the way. But the HBC and the CFC were not on the best of terms. Test Alliance had once been a part of the CFC, and they had been allies with Goonswarm. They, in fact, lived up in Declan in what was famously called the Testagram, because it was a small pentagram in Declan, a constellation in Declan that was in the shape of a pentagram that you had them living in. And when they wanted to strike out on their own, the CFC aided them. They aided them taking Fountain and Delve from the previous residents. And then Test Alliance, for one reason or the other, had a falling out with Goonswarm Federation and the CFC. Now, there is a very strong debate, and it's very heated at times, over who was in the right, who was in the wrong. I'm not getting into that. I'm just stating the facts. There was a falling out, and the two sides parted amicably, to a degree. So then when Test Alliance started teaming up with these groups like Raiden, like Tribal Band, like Northern Coalition, like Pandemic Legion, groups who had traditionally been hostile to the CFC. If you were to say that, it's for a lack of a better term, because these were groups that had raided CFC's space. They had attacked each other's assets. They had attacked each other numerous times over the years. And so these groups started to form, and from the CFC's perspective, they started to see that their enemies were coalescing. They're bandying around Test Alliance, please ignore, who had previously been an ally. And that caused problems on a political level. Now, right around the same time, there was the financial level and the financial interests of all these parties that were involved. And that mostly is what led to this war to be a thing. back in 2013 and throughout 2012 and a little bit before that, there was an organization of player groups represented by Goonswarm Federation, Test Alliance Please Ignore, Pandemic Legion, Northern Coalition, and Evoke. 5 of the biggest, most powerful player groups in the game in terms of just military might. They had, at some level, developed an understanding and an agreement where they would not attack each other's R64 technetium moons. Now you may be asking yourself, what is technetium? What is an R64? In terms of EVE, R64s are very rare, very high-valued moons. It's what most people in nullsec fight over these days, even today in 2016. In 2012 and 2013 was no different. Technetium was a very rare resource. It was a specific type of resource and a specific type of moon that you found on R64s. And they helped create a cartel of sorts. The Goonswarm Federation, Pandemic Legion, all these guys, they created a cartel, a protection group, basically saying, we will work with each other to protect each other's assets, but we won't attack each other's assets as well. So Pandemic Legion would not attack R64 moons belonging to the CFC. The CFC would not attack R64 moons belonging to Pandemic Legion, Test Alliance, anyone else in the little financial cartel, if you will. And this was cheekily called OTEC, named after OPEC, which is, of course, a real-world thing that involves the United States, Saudi Arabia, some of these other oil-rich countries that agree that for the interests of each other, they will not, do damage to each other in terms of financial damage with regards to this product that they're trying to sell and trying to put a control on. Technetium at the time was also very important to various aspects of EVE that, not to get into too much detail on, meant that these groups made a fair amount of money. Not as much as when it came down to renter alliances later on in EVE Online's history, but it was still very lucrative and very good for these groups to work together to ensure their financial stability with OTEC. And the Technetium moons were a problem that CCP eventually saw. And they saw these groups that were larger than them, that were larger than everyone else in the game, that they were able to basically muscle their way in. They set up this cartel of a financial group, and it caused problems. And it's not in the way that it was causing people to unsubscribe, but it was causing balance problems. And CCP liked to fiddle with the balances every now and then. So when you had OTEC be a thing, CCP started to realize that Technetium moons were a little too lucrative. So they started to tweak and balance them. They started to affect them to some degree or the other. And then came, shortly after FanFest 2013, the Odyssey patch. Now, before we get into the Odyssey patch, we have to also talk about the political standings of the HBC. In May of 2013, Test Alliance opted to leave the Honey Badger Coalition. And while you may see what's on the screen right now and say, oh, it's the Mittani.com, how dare you go to that site? Unfortunately, a lot of the records of what happened right around this time have been lost due to various websites being shut down or archive backups being lost. So this is arguably the best source of the material. And I have no problems with Mittani.com because at this time in the Mittani.com's history, it was the go-to EVE site. It was the definitive source for a lot of what was going on in EVE at the time, with the exception of EVE News 24. But even then, you could hotly debate whether or not EVE News 24 was as good of a source in terms of quality as the Mittani.com was at the time. Nowadays, you can argue all you want about whether or not it is an appropriate site to use, whether or not it's fair or not, but regardless. So at the time of May 4th, 2013, Test Alliance Please Ignore left the HBC. They had grown to have grown to basically be unhappy with the HBC. They were the largest alliance by far in terms of just pure player numbers and character numbers. But they weren't, arguably, and I say arguably with very strong emphasis, given the the sort of respect that you would expect a large brute force of test to receive. And there was other political issues. And at the time, Honey Badger Coalition was, to my recollection, and to most people's recollection, at the very end, right around this time, ran by a player named Sort Dragon. Now, Sort Dragon was, at the time, a member of Pandemic Legion. He now is a member of another alliance called Darkness that lead the Guardians of the Galaxy Coalition, who went on to do various things throughout EVE history, and Darkness has been involved in several things. And Sort Dragon will play a very big role in the early stages of Fountain War when we get into the nitty-gritty of the Fountain War itself, which we'll do on a future episode. But test leader Buddha also opted to leave HBC only a week after he had become the CEO of the Alliance. There was some issues going on here and there within Test Alliance that we can get into in a future episode, but Test opted to leave the HBC. Now, this was, if you were to compare this to a modern day organization, it would be like saying the United States decided to pull out of NATO, or the United States decided to pull themselves out of a large organization. Basically, it was the military might of a large group saying, we are no longer part of this group, and leaving essentially the smaller groups to deal with it. Now, right around the same time, another member of the HBC, an organization called Raiden, they ended up disbanding, meaning that an entire region of HBC space, if we look down here at the map, if we take a quick look, you'll see that at the time, Raiden dwelled within Aquarius, and they had disbanded, seemingly within the course of a month. Now, they hadn't been the strongest of alliances. They hadn't been, very steadfast and stoic like other groups had been in EVE's history, but they were still a member of the HBC, and unfortunately, they collapsed. And this caused an issue with HBC where they not only lost Fountain and Delve in terms of losing Test Alliance Please Ignore, they lost Aquarius because that member group disbanded. Now, to HBC's credit, they did end up taking space. They did end up moving in and controlling the situation. And that was a good thing. Obviously, you want to be able to control your land. You want to be able to control your region of the game. But even then, it was, I wouldn't say it was the canary in the coal mine, but it was a bit of a prelude of things to come. Now, right around the same time as well, when Test Alliance Please Ignore ended up leaving the HBC, they allowed a few alliances and a few systems to stay within their space. Now, they had left the HBC, and some of these systems and some of these alliances that were still within pockets of Fountain and Delve that Test owned and controlled, such as, Mistakes Were Made and, a couple of other spots, they were still allowed to stay there. There was no love loss. There was no, animosity between HBC and Test. It was simply that for financial reasons, again, a theme that you'll see throughout EVE history and EVE war stories, finance always comes into play. These groups were allowed to stay in Test space because they were building supercarriers and Titans, and they couldn't just cancel them up and straight away because that's billions of ISK. That's hundreds of billions of ISK destroyed and wasted because of a political issue that no one wants to suffer from. But unfortunately for Test, later on in the Fountain War again, which involves Sort Dragon, and again we'll talk about this in a future episode, this would be a poor decision. This would cause a problem because of these financial incentives and these financial warrants and these financial needs of these groups, they would clash with the political. And so you would end up having these problems where systems were dropped. And again, we'll get into more details of that later on. But anyway, so Raiden disbands, and it's a huge deal. It's a huge deal because an entire region is gone. And essentially at that point, with Test leaving and Raiden disbanding, you have essentially the destruction and the death of the HBC as we know it. Now, for a few reasons, there wasn't any formalized shutdown of the HBC. It wasn't one day it's there and then the next day it's not. It was a slow degradation. It slowly died. It was slowly just bleeding out, and for the most part, HBC was dead. Now there was still, you still had Test Alliance, and you still had Tribal Band, and they still mostly stayed friendly with one another in this time period. If we switch over to a map on June 10th, you can see quickly that Aquarius Northern Coalition moved in. And if you notice the Initiative, who are a member of the CFC and a current member of the CFC, they weren't at the time, as far as I remember, but the Initiative were taking space in Aquarius, and they were poking and prodding. They weren't causing too much problems, mind you, but they were still taking advantage of the situation. And in fact, I'm pretty certain to a degree they were involved with the HBC, but my recollection and my info could be off on that. But if we look at Test Alliance and Tribal Band, they controlled between these two alliances 3 regions. Now, again, this is under Dominion Solve. This was 3 years ago. This was a completely different landscape with how EVE worked and how things behaved. But what caused a lot of their downfall, and essentially the fall from grace that Test had reached at this point, this was Test's biggest moment. This was Test on the biggest stage they had ever been on at the time. What kind of caused all this was a little, well, not a little, but a significant change in how R64s and technetium worked. Again, it's that financial incentive, it's that financial driver, that conflict creator that led to a war. So, as we discussed, OTEC was a very real thing, and as time went on, it would eventually form and take a new shape within the era of renter alliances for about 2 to 3 years. But at the time, back in 2013, OTEC was still focused on moons. And moons were getting changed. And the Odyssey patch. And the Odyssey patch came out in 2013. It came out shortly after FanFest. And there's a very great moment, we can talk about this in a future episode, where Shadow of Pandemic Legion announced that they were formally resetting the HBC. So this was a brewing conflict. There was political issues. There was soon to come financial ones. Now everyone knew about these moon changes that were coming in Odyssey. CCP have always said, well ahead of time, what the patch notes are going to be, what the changes are going to be, what they're planning. They usually do a good job of it. So the CFC, who again lived predominantly in the north, they realized that a lot of our money and a lot of our income right now, because again the CFC doesn't use They don't use renter alliances. They don't use what they would then classify as slave labor to a degree. They don't use any of that. What they do is they focus on money-making schemes through other methods. So you have things like the OTEC deal, the L4 mission thing that they did shortly before this, or right around the same time. They do other things to make their money, and they noticed that Fountain region, which was just on the outskirts of their home, right here, that was likely to have more moons of other variety outside of technetium, because these changes were affecting technetium specifically. Technetium was being nerfed, in a sense, by CCP. The CFC realized that Fountain region would be a good acquisition, because it would grant them the ability to take a region and have a significant number more moons than what they currently had. So their plan at the time was to essentially simply just grow one region. That's all you needed. And they would be financially stable. At least that's what they were saying internally. That's what they were saying externally. When they announced their invasion, the Mittani, who headed up Goonswarm Federation, said, "Odyssey has come, and it has left us destitute. For the past few years, our coalition has become accustomed to a lifestyle that is the envy of EVE Online itself. Due to technetium and sound fiscal management, we have been able to fund a peacetime reimbursement system, carrier giveaways, and galaxy-changing events like Burnjita, the Ice Interdiction, and now that is all changed. Odyssey has stripped the value of our regions. To compensate, other alliances have set up rental programs, something that we despise." Now this is a very important thing. This is an ideological thing. This is where finance and ideology come into conflict. This war, this Fountain War that we've just now jumped into as a coalition, that we were trying to find a way to work around, to eventually, this was the only option we had, was war. We could have taken now, what Montani is saying in the speech is, they could have taken the easy way out. They could have set up renter alliances like S2N Citizens, or like Northern Associates, or Brothers of Tangra, like their OTEC partners had. Even Test Alliance had their own renter alliance. It was Test Friends Please Ignore. But at an ideological level, the Clusterfuck Coalition decided, no, we can't do that. We don't want to do that. But at a financial level, they knew that they needed new forms of income. And as you can imagine, there is that's one of the greatest storytelling methods. That's one of the greatest ways stories are told, is where ideologies come into conflict, where one side believes in something, the other side believes in something else. But in this situation, we have that, but we also have this financial incentive, and that is the conflict driver. And I've talked about this on various live streams and previous shows, I believe, where financial incentives are important to EVE Online. They're important to what creates a war. They're important to what makes us do what we do in nullsec. It's what makes nullsec nullsec. That's why people go to war. It's that financial incentive. It's that financial reasoning to go attack someone else and destroy their sandcastle. Now, that's not the only reason. That's not the only thing people look for, but it is one of the big reasons we do what we do. Now, you may question whether or not this was the best decision. Why invade Fountain? Why not invade, let's say Geminate? Why not attack Geminate? Why not attack any of these other areas, like Omist, like Cobalt Edge? Fountain, through the balance changes that CCP had put out, made it one of the more vibrant and lucrative systems. it had a higher density of R64 moons and R32 moons and R8 moons because of these balance changes. And that ultimately was the only reason the CFC wanted to go at it. Now, there is an argument that due to political shenanigans by Test Alliance Please Ignore, by the Clusterfuck Coalition, by Buddha, by the Mittani, that conflict was inevitable. And we can argue and debate this till we're blue in the face, but ultimately we all have to agree that a big driving factor is that finance. It's that financial incentive. That's what you want out of this. You don't take an entire region, on a whim. No one does that in EVE. Nowadays, maybe in Aegis, but back in Dominion, when you had to grind through station timers and station health, and then you had to do it again for the TCUs and the stations and the sovereignty blockade units and the iHub. No one took regions for the whim, for just the experience of taking a region. They took regions because they knew that they needed to take them, and they took regions because that was what they were there to do. So when you have these things where CFC are having political issues with Test Alliance Please Ignore, where Test Alliance are having issues with the HBC, where the HBC is having issues with both parties, you start to create a bit of a fracas, a bit of a heated area. And there was many heated arguments and debates held on various forums across EVE's many online forums, from kugutsumin.com, from the EVE Online forums, to the Something Awful forums, to Reddit at the time, even then, to the comment sections of articles themselves on EVE News 24 and the Mittani.com. You still had this heated investment and this heated interest. Now, again, you have this ideology where the CFC don't want a renter empire. Now, eventually they do. Eventually they do set up a renter empire, because ultimately their plan to just take a region kind of blows up in their face. And we'll talk about that again in a future episode when we talk about the proper Fountain War and potential in the aftermath of it. But you also have the ideology of Test Alliance, where they no longer want it to be this second fiddle to Goonswarm Federation. Now, remember, they were friends with Goonswarm Federation. They were allies. They were part of the CFC at one point, but they just didn't get along, just due down to their cultural differences as groups, their tribal differences, if you will, because humans are tribal by nature. There was a conflict of ideologies started purely because of this financial cause. Now, if there was a different region in the game, again, like let's say Cobalt Edge, very likely that fountain wouldn't have been touched until political issues spilled over. But even then, it's purely speculative. So it's so hard and so important to understand. It's not hard, but it's very important to explain, and can be a bit difficult to explain, that this financial change in the game and change in how five very large alliances, if you will. Remember, these were 5 big alliances. Test Alliance controlled 2 regions. Goonswarm Federation controlled 2 regions and ran a coalition. Northern Coalition controlled a region or 2. And while the N3 Coalition wasn't necessarily what we know of it being today, and remember it as after, and during the Halloween War, it was still the early stages of the N3 Coalition. So Northern Coalition ran its own coalition. Pandemic Legion were a bit on the outskirts of most of these coalitions, but still involved with a lot of them. Evoke, who, again, we may not think of today as this large group, but they were still important. When 5 of the biggest groups in the game get affected in this way, something's going to happen. Now, CCP may not have predicted a war in Fountain. They may not have predicted the Battle of 6 VDT. They may not have predicted the destruction of Test Alliance, the rise of Renter Empires. They may not have predicted any of that. And I'm hopeful that they didn't. But at the same time, you can't do these changes without major shifts in the game. So, leading up to Fountain War, Eve was completely different. There was so much going into Fountain War, not just from an ideological standpoint, not just from a community standpoint, not just from a gameplay standpoint. It was everything. Eve was completely different. There was so much happening. There was internal issues with Test. There was external issues with and internal issues with the HBC. Test was feeling issues from, internal conflicts as well as external conflicts. And that was a huge factor into it. If you're going to attack someone who has what you want, you're not going to attack them when they're the strongest. You're going to attack them when they're the weakest. Especially if you have this incentive of they have land and property that we want to take. They're going to be attacked. We've seen it throughout history. So, in human history. So, while you can't fault the CFC, you can understand that, you can at least sympathize with Test that they were in a bad position. Before the war even started, they were in a bad position. And I think that's where we're going to leave it. Because right as the war starts, right as Fountain War begins, that's when all this just reaches a point where it just overflows. It causes tons of drama, tons of issues happen, both with regards to Test itself, but within areas of the game that we still debate and argue and talk about to this day. And that's the legacy that a Fountain War has. That's why it's important to understand that the things that went into the Fountain War, the things that caused the Fountain War to take place, are important to understand. Because when you get to this point where you understand that so much of this financial investment, community investment, ideological investment went into this war, then you can begin to understand the importance of the Fountain War. And with that, I'll be ending this episode. Like I said, next week I will not be here, but when I get back, we will definitely talk about Fountain War. But if you have any questions, shoot them in the chat, and I will try to talk about them. I'll try to at least converse with you about what I've been talking about here, and we can at least discuss some of the issues that led to the Fountain War. Okay. Well, it doesn't look like there's any questions, but I will say that I thank you very much for everyone who tunes into this every week, and that it's very appreciated that you guys, watch the shows, watch the VODs, watch it live. The people who come on and help, that's very important, and I thank you very much for that. So with that, we will be ending this episode. I thank you very much. And again, next week I will not be here. The VOD for this episode will go up on the 18th or the 10th. not the 18th, the 17th, and the VOD for the Guiding Hand Social Club episode will go up on the 10th. Thank you very much for watching, guys. Have a good night, and stay safe.